Okay, welcome to chapter 15. One more chapter to go in the text, and then we'll have completed the course. Now, 15 and 16 are a little bit of departure from what we did previously, whereas, with the exception of some of the introductory chapters at the beginning, we had really three major parts of the criminal justice system we focused on. We focused on the police at first, and then we moved in both chronological and procedural order to the courts, and then we moved to corrections. Well, now we're going to take a step back, kind of get a couple catch-all chapters here. Chapter 15 is going to be all about the juvenile justice system. It's going to focus on how there were, again, my favorite terms, I guess, ones you're probably sick of in this course, how there were changes over time, chronocentrism, and over perception, social perception, ethnocentrism. All right, so moving along, some obvious questions to ask is, we have a special system for juveniles. We have juvenile law, we have juvenile courts, we have juvenile facilities. Why? Why do we give juveniles this special system and special treatment? What distinguishes them from others that have marked differences in our societies? For example, why don't we have an elderly court for people over 65 or 75? Why don't we have one for people who are physically handicapped? You could argue to some extent we do have some for those that are mentally handicapped, but it's a very ill-defined system. Why not, as opposed to an innate condition like age or ability, why not veterans having separate systems? And again, there are veterans courts. So, next question to ask is as you may or may not know, many juvenile records are kept secret. Why? What arguments are used to say that we should have a protection of juvenile records? Maybe this should apply to everybody, or maybe it should apply to no one. What's your reason for saying juvenile records are special? What's the best way to treat the juvenile in the system? For example, if you're saying that we're more interested in his welfare than in conviction, why does that change when someone is no longer a juvenile? Is the family a better option in the state? That is, returning the juvenile to the family unit, is that more important? What other purposes are served by the system? So the juvenile system might have stated goals. What are some of the reasons that the poor, males, and minorities are overrepresented? All right. When did this all kind of get going? And excuse me, I'm fighting a bit of a cold, I guess. Well, around about the turn from the late 1800s to the early 1900s, the turn to the 20th century, there was a large, what was then called a progressive movement. Now, some of it was even earlier. The abolitionist movement really got going in the 1830s and 40s. The women's suffrage movement got active a little bit later, and Prohibition was active as well. Prohibition became quite a large political party in the United States for several elections. But one of the things that also was created was what was then called the child savers, or the child saving movement. And part of this is the idea of parens patria, that literally your country is your parent, your father. And the idea was that the state, when you're not as a child being protected by your parents, that the state can intervene and protect you from being abused or neglected by members of your family. And this is in contrast to the older, and again this is Latin, paterfamilia, which was the idea that the father in the family was the supreme voice. He could do what he wanted. Now, in extreme cases under paterfamilia, not in the United States but in other countries, the father had the power to kill family members who disobeyed him. We've all, I think, heard of honor killings in some societies. Well, these existed in Western societies, certainly existed in ancient Rome. So, at first, we would say that the family is the absolute arbiter of how children are treated. But as we begin to develop as a society, change as a society, perhaps a better word than develop, this was challenged, and we started to say, well, maybe there's moments when we need to step in and take the power away from the parents. Okay, so early on in our system, early in the 1800s, as America developed in the country, juveniles were treated pretty much the same as adults. They had the same courts, they had the same rights to some extent, they suffered the same penalties. But gradually, we begin to see changes, even predating what I would call the formal child saver movement. We saw attempts to establish separate homes, separate treatment for juveniles. For example, in New York City, the House of Refuge opened as early as 1825. Increasingly, the state began to regulate the treatment of children and young adults. Whereas previously they said, once you're no longer an infant, once they drew that line at, over the age of 6, 1 to 6 you're an infant, there's no charges. That was the common law. People began to say, well, really a 7-year-old, an 8-year-old, a 9-year-old, a 10-year-old shouldn't be treated the same way as a 30 and a 40-year-old. Now, as I said, the real turn starts to come right as the 19th century is ending and the 20th century is beginning. In 1899, Illinois passed the first real comprehensive set of juvenile law. And it established the first courts for these juveniles, which formerly had been just young adults. Now, most states will do this early in the 20th century. North Carolina passes its Probation Courts Act in 1915. It establishes dependent and delinquent status. It separates juvenile trials. It separates facilities for records and incarceration. So really it's this attempt. So North Carolina is about in the middle there. I mean, the first states act as early as 1899. North Carolina acts by about 1915, and some states hold out all the way to 1945. By the middle part of the 20th century, we were recognizing that children are not fully responsible for their actions like adults are. So we broadly break down juvenile justice into two categories: status offenses and delinquency. So a status offense is something that a juvenile that can bring them under the authority of the court or the juvenile justice system, that if an adult did it, it wouldn't be illegal. So a quick example of this would be drinking alcohol. If you're 35 and you buy a 6-pack of beer and consume it, it's not a crime. If you're 15, it is. Delinquency, on the other hand, is something that is illegal, whether it's committed by someone under a certain age or over a certain age. So, for example, if I take a rock and I'm 25 and I throw it through a window, that's a crime. Destruction of property, or conceivably even something weird like a trespass in some states. A certain vandalism might exist as a charge in some states. But whether I'm 25 or 15 or 65, that's still a crime. Now, under the age, whatever the age of juvenile status is, it'll be called delinquency and will be treated separately in the juvenile system. So we do change the terminology here. So in regular court, we have the term crime. In juvenile court, we call it a delinquent act. In regular court, we have a complaint, often filed against an individual. In juvenile court, it's called a petition. Arrest is called intake. A conviction or a trial is called an adjudication. And a sentence is called a disposition. So we do change the terms to even separate juvenile law and juvenile courts, from the main body of the criminal law. And you should be aware that we do have classes at Wake Tech covering this entire field. Like most of the chapters in this text, juvenile law is a separate body of law and a separate class we offer. All right, so what status offenses are we really focusing on here? All right, well, what's one of the fundamental characteristics of juveniles? They go to school, but some don't. So 51% now of the about 110,000 status offenses that were prosecuted in the United States, okay, and this I think is a 2015 chart if I'm not mistaken, the number one, the 51% violation is you didn't go to school. It's followed by liquor law violations. Then it's followed by ones that are a little bit less clear. Ungovernability, which basically means you're out of the control of the parents, they no longer can control you. Curfew violations, self-explanatory. Running away from home, and then a kind of a catch-all 8%. But by far the largest is school. Because as much as we believe as a society that hard work is good for you, we also believe education is good for you. Now, early juvenile systems had very few safeguards for the juvenile. So the juvenile, first of all, had almost no rights under this system. They did not have the right to a defense attorney. They did not have the right to really present their case in a proper, organized, monitored fashion. They didn't have the right of bail. They didn't have the right of appeal. And the rationale behind all this was, well, this isn't really a trial. This isn't really pitting two things against each other. We're not trying to treat him like a criminal. We're trying to help him. So these other things, a separate attorney, proper procedure, bail, appeal, those really are for people who are potentially guilty of crimes that we're going to punish. This is a juvenile that we're not seeking to punish, we're seeking to help. That was the rationale. Now the problem is clearly abuses started to creep into the system, because even if we said we were trying to help, the end result looked a lot like prison very often. This starts to change in a series of cases in the 1960s, like so much of American law, where there's a series of just groundbreaking cases. So the big important ones, and if we had time, we would go into these in great detail. Kent versus the United States, very important. It gives the right to counsel and a hearing if the juvenile is being transferred out. So that was really the first major one, but the next two I would say that are the most important is in re Galt and in re Winship. Now when you see a case that says in re, I-N space R-E, in re, it means in the matter of. So usually that's going to tell you it's a conservatorship case, it's a juvenile case, it might be a mental health case, because there's no opposing person there. In re Galt in 1967, they said, okay, and this is arguably the most important case, juveniles should get the same basic procedure that you give to adults, because they really are facing prison. We might call it something different, but it's prison. And this was reinforced in cases like in re Winship and Breed versus Jones. All right, well, the first thing that we had to debate is, okay, well, what age are we going to do it? Are we going to draw a line? And we really decided quite early on that we weren't going to do a case-by-case analysis, is this person a juvenile or an individual, completely. Instead, we were going to have a general rule about age. Now, traditionally, a juvenile in North Carolina was after your 6th birthday until your 16th birthday. So you had 10 years there. After your 16th birthday, you were an adult in North Carolina. Now, a couple of years ago, North Carolina modified this and raised it to 18. However, North Carolina will keep you a juvenile in most cases between 6 and 15. If you are 16 years old to 17 years old, it's easier to transport you or move you into the adult court. And of course, if you're 6, you really can't be prosecuted under 6. But if you're 6 to 16, it's very difficult to move you over to court, regular court. Okay, here is the breakdown of minimum age at which you can be tried as an adult. And you notice that North Carolina can be tried as early as 6, which is a bit alarming, along with Arizona, New York, Massachusetts, and I believe Maryland. Most states it's 10 years of age, and some states have no minimum whatsoever. So just a little bit of a chart there to give you an idea. Okay, Here's the other good news. Juveniles are committing fewer crimes than their parents. Now, I know I was listening to the news today, and I had started off these lectures talking about how the crime rate is going down. And the crime rate in 2021 is seeing a large spike in murders. Now, we're not exactly sure why, because many other crimes, property crimes, other crimes of violence, are decreasing still. They're still going down. But we saw a one-year jump of 30% in 2021. 2020 or in 2021, really 2020. Lots of argument about why that is. Is it because people were quarantined and with each other, more person-to-person contact maybe led to higher murder rates? Is it because there was more gun sales? Is it because there was some additional stress? I mean, we don't know yet. But surely it's some unusual, because we've never seen an increase like this in just one crime so dramatically. All right, but let's return to juvenile justice. Juveniles are committing fewer crimes than their parents. So if you look, juvenile crime peaks, if we look at the aggravated assault, which is really attacking someone, and the robbery rates, you'll see that they peak right around 1997, 1998, roughly about the time your parents are your age. I'm talking to most of you who are in your teens. So you can go home and tell your parents that you are much better behaved than they are. If we look at the aggravated assault, there was approximately 300 per 100,000 in society. If we look at it today, it's down to 100. So it's fallen by 2/3. It's an amazing decline. And the murder rate has fallen also. You'll notice the murder rate's down. Although, again, we have this new statistic that we don't know quite what to make of. So what are some trends in juvenile delinquency currently? Well, the number of juvenile inmates has decreased about 50% in the last roughly 20 years. This may be because of different juvenile curfews, different quality of life crimes being prosecuted or not, local programs, diversion, lots of reasons for that. We do know that if we look at delinquency, that African Americans, blacks, are vastly overrepresented in the system. 6 out of every 10 juveniles in state custody belong to a minority group. So again, much like when we look at the male breakdown of prisoners, not so much the female. Remember, last time we looked at female breakdown of prisoners, and it's much closer to society's numbers in generals. But males, there's 6 out of 10 of them are in these minority groups. And again, lots of potential explanations for that. One would be systemic racism. Another might be that family structure, or it might be a wealth problem masquerading as a race problem. If you say that minorities, or many minorities, are poorer than the general population, and poor people tend to go into the system more, either because they commit more crimes or because rich people are able to avoid the system, either explanation will work there, then you're going to simply have more minorities in the system because of wealth. You know, one of the ways you would study that would be, what about race controlled for wealth? So if you said how many minorities whose families earn at least, pick an arbitrary number, $100,000 go to jail, versus how many whites that made $100,000 go to jail, you'd be able to control for wealth a little bit, and that would be a more sophisticated study. Arrest rates for girls have been falling slower than for boys. A few more detentions, a little bit more family-based delinquency there as well. More about that. Okay, schools have played an increasing role in delinquency. One of the reasons for this is that most schools now, including schools in North Carolina, have resource officers or police officers that literally work inside the school. We also have more cameras, more controlled access. Now the result of this is really to widen the net. In 2017, one of the last years I could find good numbers for in North Carolina, 40% of the referrals to the North Carolina delinquency courts, North Carolina juvenile courts, came from schools. And this really raises the issue of bullying we could talk about here. What things are physical abuse, verbal abuse, social, emotional, cyber abuse. Have those things, have we widened the net? Are we simply bringing more behavior that previously went unreported or was handled informally? Or are we really identifying things that are crimes that we just never got around to prosecuting? So every state has these anti-bullying acts, and clearly that's having some role on delinquency. Okay, the link between delinquency and crime. Because one of the reasons that we're going to study juvenile justice is age seems to be a great predictor of criminal activity. Now the first, and I've talked about this term before a couple times in this class, the first thing to talk about here is aging out, and the second thing to talk about is age of onset. So first, aging out. What we know is that as people get older, when they're very, very young, the probability of a 4 or 5-year-old being a criminal is vanishingly small. But there is a steep gradient where the number of crimes committed goes up, 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 and then it sort of peaks, and you can see that peak at different crimes, peaks at different times. But let's just say that it peaks at 25. So, in other words, a young male is most likely to commit, say, the crime of aggravated assault at age 25. If we then look at age 35, the probability of that young male adult committing the crime has dropped significantly. And if we go all the way to 65, it's become vanishingly small. And this phenomenon where people stop committing crimes as they get older, or desist as we sometimes call it, is called aging out. And it's a well-established phenomenon. It's really not something I would say that's open for debate. It's simply a fact that we have to assume. It's been borne by a lot of information by this point, a lot of data supporting it. It's really not open to a lot of debate. Now the next term, which is very important, is called age of onset. And this doesn't focus on when crime stops aging out. It focuses on when it starts. At what age does a person commit their first crime? Now, this is a really interesting fact that we discovered. We found that the earlier people start crimes, the greater the danger that they will commit more serious crimes and the longer they'll commit crimes. So if you can keep people somehow from committing their first minor crime till they're 18 or 19 or 20, then the odds of them becoming a serious criminal drop dramatically. On the other hand, if they commit their first serious crime at 12 or 13, have an early age of onset, then there's greater danger. And if it's preteen, it's even higher. And this doesn't just apply to crime. One of the things we found is addiction is driven by this phenomenon as well. Age of onset, the earlier the age of onset, the higher the possibility of addiction. So if you have someone that experiments with alcohol at a very early age, 8, 9, 10, okay, particularly to the point of abuse, the probability of issues later is very, very high. And the same goes for drugs as well. All right, substance abuse. Now, one of the questions we always have is, it's true that there is a link between illegal drug use and alcohol use and juvenile delinquency. We know these two things go hand in hand. What we don't know is the drug use and the alcohol abuse causing the delinquency, or is there some underlying factor which is triggering both? So is it a causation factor or a correlation factor? And let me give you a quick example. The most common drug that juveniles abuse, that they're not allowed to have, is tobacco. Now, it doesn't seem rational, although you could do studies about this, it doesn't seem rational to say, well, tobacco then obviously is causing crime. How would smoking a cigarette cause you to go out and rob a store or mug a person? So there you would probably say, well, yeah, tobacco use is a correlative factor with this type of substance abuse is a correlative factor. It goes hand in hand with delinquency, but it doesn't cause it. Now, Child abuse and child neglect, on the other hand, seems to quite clearly be a causative factor. Now, if we're going to define these terms, abuse is the intentional infliction of physical and or emotional pain on a child. Neglect is when you deprive that child through negligence, not through the intent, then it becomes abuse, of love, of shelter, of food, and basic care. What we do know in the United States, rather shockingly, is that 10%, 1 out of 10 children in the United States, suffer some level of abuse or neglect from their family. And what we also know is that abuse or neglect doubles the chances you will grow up and commit crimes, that you will be a juvenile delinquent, in other words. Juvenile gangs. One of the things that we think goes on with gangs and juveniles and gangs is that juveniles tend to use gangs as substitute families. They recreate the family by joining the gang. It gives them identity, it gives them protection, it gives them fellowship. Now, obviously, it takes things from you. I'm not advocating that gangs are a substitute for families. And gangs simply are 3 or more people separated from the general population by clothing, by vocabulary, by signals, by names, and they often, when we're concerned with them, are engaging in criminal activity. Juveniles, again, who suffer abuse or neglect are far more likely to join these gangs. Typically, gang membership is a late teen activity, and it has the strongest ethnic component that we can see. So, if we look at gangs, first of all, unlike a lot of the other crime in the United States, where the leading group that's incarcerated proportionally is African Americans, gang membership is concentrated among Hispanics. And interestingly, this has been true for a long time. So we had the famous Zoot Suit riots, believe it or not, in Los Angeles in the 50s, and there were Hispanic gangs in the 50s in the United States that were quite significant. Even if you go back to, obviously it's a fictional portrayal, but if you go back to West Side Story, the gangs in there, at least one of the gangs, is Latino or Hispanic in its representation. The Jets and the Sharks, if you recall. Typically, gang members come from lower social and economic groups. They usually are urban-based. Gangs are more common in cities, but they have expanded in rural and suburban communities, and they are predominantly male. Let's talk about how juveniles get into the system. Well, there are about 500,000 juvenile arrests per year. And one of the reasons they can do this is the police and the courts can take people into custody because of the term loco parentis, that literally you are in the place of the parent. We are going to take a juvenile into custody, even if it's a status offense. Remember, something that an adult does is not a crime, because I'm acting in the best interest of the juvenile. Now, the interesting thing is, police have a tremendous amount of discretion here, who they bring into the system. And again, this would be when discretion is being exercised. This is when people's own opinions and groups of people's opinions matter the most. So the police have tremendous power whether they're going to escalate and bring someone into custody or ignore juvenile behavior, just take them back to the parents or something. So what are the factors that go into this decision? Well, one is, what did the kid do? If he killed somebody, he's going in the system. But if they caught him trespassing on the school late at night, they may just take him back to his parents, or they may charge him with trespassing. What's his past history? How many times has he been in the system? Do the cops know him? Where did the offense take place? Was it at home? Was it at church? Where was it? What's the family like? Are the children's parents ready to take a disciplinary action here? What's the attitude of the offender? And what the offender's gender is important. Minorities are vastly overrepresented in these juvenile intakes. In fact, blacks are twice as likely to be referred as whites. And it seems to be the attitude of the juvenile is what's most critical here. And it's just a truth that if you are cooperative, if you acknowledge the authority of the police officer, or if you want to look at this in a negative sense, if you kiss his butt, then the probability of going into the juvenile system goes down. If you don't, if you're belligerent, if you're confrontational, if you stand on your rights, things like that, I'm spinning it positively there, then you can very easily wind up in the system. And it seems that race and ethnicity play critical roles here. All right, so typically you are brought into the system either by a petition, remember that's a complaint, or an arrest. The petition is the formal document filed with the court that says you're delinquent, you've committed these crimes, or you've committed a status offense. Now, sometimes at this point, we're going to say, or the prosecution is going to say, hey, you don't belong in the juvenile system, you belong in the adult system, and we're going to transfer you. And this is transferred to adult court. The more serious the crime and the older the juvenile is, the more likely to get transferred. If you have a 7-year-old commit a crime, the odds of him going to anything other than juvenile court approach 0. If you have someone that's 17 and a half and commits a murder, the odds of him not being tried as an adult are minuscule. So a lot of what goes on next is pretrial diversion. Is it really in the best interest of the child to go forward and keep this person and put him into the whole system? Diversion, you're going to remove these low-risk offenders from the formal system and put them in some sort of community-based rehabilitation program. And this can be treatment or restitution. This can be formal or informal. And part of this is we're doing it so that we don't give the label to the juvenile of a juvenile delinquent, which means, if you remember labeling from way back, it's something he might live up to. Again, you can have transfer to adult court. Most juveniles, with a get tough approach, more juveniles, will wind up in adult court. So about 4,000 per year. Now, in North Carolina, we have a discretionary waiver where it's up to the judge to transfer. And we have a mandatory waiver where if you commit murder after age 13, you're going to get tried as an adult. So we've got two options there. All right, detention. After the intake, your arrest, remember, the offender is placed in a detention facility. Now, in North Carolina, we don't tend to have a lot of separate facilities, so we usually house them in jail, but we separate them from the general population. And then within 24 hours, we have a detention hearing, and we say, okay, are you a danger to the community? Is it probable you will or won't return? Are you in danger of injury, self-injury, or injury of others? All these are factors to determine whether we continue the detention. After the detention, we're going to get to the trial, or what we call the adjudication. And the trial is a little bit different. You know, the adult trial is really focused, because we believe so much in rational choice and free will. Did you do it? Here's your punishment if you did. Adjudication is focused on, did you do it? How can we help you and get you off this path? So adjudication determines, are you delinquent or do you need some type of supervision? And it's a hearing. It's much less formal than a court. The rules are not as strict. And at the end of it, the judge makes a ruling based on the evidence that's been presented, and he really decides whether the person is delinquent or is in need of supervision or can be released. So this judge, one of the things he considers are these predisposition reports. This is just like the pre-sentencing report we talked about in correctional law, where we provide people, a corrections officer goes out and does investigation, says this is what this guy's home's like, this is what her parents are like, this is what his school's like, this is how he interacts with others. And that gives the judge the ability to make the decision, am I going to incarcerate him I'm going to put them in a juvenile facility that lock them up, basically. Am I going to put them on probation? Am I going to choose some community treatment? And again, the judge will look at what did he do, how many times he's been in front of me, what's the family situation, and what is his or her attitude. Okay, so we're looking at probation, confinement, and aftercare. The most common thing you get is probation. The majority of juveniles don't wind up with anything more serious than they're put on probation. And it's very similar to adult probation. It's monitored or at different levels depending on the crime and stuff you committed. 54,000 youths, however, are incarcerated. And this can be either in a secure environment, including things like boot camps, training camps, reformatory schools, or it can be in a non-secure confinement like a foster care program, a group home, or even rural programs. And after this, we sometimes will follow up. There'll be therapeutic, educational, counseling programs after you're released from the formal custody to help you or help them not reoffend. Okay, a little bit shorter, but on that note, we've got one more chapter to go, and when you're ready, play it and you're done with the course.